Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down some truly incredible stories. Today, we're diving into a heist that baffled investigators for years, a fortune worth billions, and the one single, unbelievable mistake that brought the whole thing crashing down.
So let's get right into it, because the answer is honestly stranger than any movie you'll ever see. This is the story of a massive digital theft that was completely unraveled by the thief himself, all because he called the police for help. You'd think a story about billions starts with billions, right? Nope. Our story actually begins with a much smaller number, $400,000. Picture this. It's September 13th, 2019. A young guy in a small Georgia town named Jimmy Zhang picks up the phone and makes a frantic call to 911. He tells the operator he's been robbed and that thieves had just made off with almost $500,000 in cash right from his house. And that brings us to our first chapter, a billionaire's 911 call. That one emergency call, that simple act of reaching out for help, would set off a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. It put Zhang on the map and ended up exposing one of the biggest and most mysterious crypto heists in U.S. history. He had absolutely no idea he was basically reporting a crime on himself. So naturally, the first question the investigators had was, who is this guy? And that leads us to the party boy's secret. I mean, how does a young guy have 400 grand in cash just lying around his house? Well, on the surface, the answer was a mystery wrapped up in a whole lot of extravagance. To everyone who knew him, Jimmy Zhang was the ultimate party boy. And I'm not exaggerating. This guy was living a life straight out of a movie. We're talking $500,000 on a single party, flying his friends on private jets to watch football games, casually walking into a bar and buying drinks for every single person there. And whenever someone asked where all this money was coming from, he had a pretty simple story. He was an early Bitcoin investor who just got really, really lucky. And you know what? Everybody believed him.
But the real source of his incredible fortune wasn't some lucky investment. No, it was tied to a notorious cold case from the darkest corners of the internet. That's right, we're talking about the Silk Road heist.
Now, to really get where this money came from, we have to rewind all the way back to 2012 and talk about a digital black market called the Silk Road. Think of it as the Amazon of the dark web. It was a totally anonymous site where you could buy just about anything illegal you can imagine, and every single transaction was done using Bitcoin. So back in 2012, a truly staggering amount of Bitcoin, over 51,000 of them, were mysteriously stolen from the Silk Road. Some hacker had figured out a loophole in the site's payment system and siphoned off what was then worth about $600,000. But that crypto was about to become worth so much more. Now, because the Silk Road was a totally illegal marketplace, none of the victims ever reported the theft. The next year, the FBI shut the whole site down. But those 51,000 Bitcoins, they were just gone, vanished without a trace. For nearly a decade, the case went ice cold, and nobody knew who the hacker was. And this, right here, is where our two stories collide. We're on to connecting the dots. That 911 call about 400 grand in stolen cash put Jimmy Zhang directly on the radar of a regional cybercrime unit. And get this, it was the very same unit that had been hunting for that missing Silk Road Bitcoin for 7 long years. The way they proved the connection was just brilliant. The investigators came up with this clever plan. 3 plainclothes officers show up at Zhang's house, pretending they're there to help him investigate his robbery. So while one officer is distracting him, another one spots his open laptop, quickly copies a Bitcoin address, and that's it. That was the smoking gun. The transaction history for that single address was a perfect breadcrumb trail leading right back to the 2012 Silk Road heist. They had their man. Now, the next step was finding those missing billions, which led them to a discovery that's almost too funny to be true: a fortune hidden in a Cheetos tin. They went back to Zhang's house, but this time they had a search warrant. The police searched the entire property. I mean, they were tapping on floor tiles, looking for hidden compartments, scouring every single room. But the massive digital fortune was nowhere to be found. And then they noticed something kind of odd. Tucked away inside a closet, they found this thing that just seemed out of place. An old popcorn tin, the novelty kind, designed to look like a giant can of Cheetos. But it felt strangely heavy, so they opened it up. And inside, hidden under a little towel, wasn't cash. It was a single, tiny computer chip, a hard wallet. a physical device that stores cryptocurrency offline. They had found the entire stolen fortune in probably the most unassuming, ridiculous place you could ever imagine.
And here's the absolutely mind-blowing part. Thanks to the incredible explosion in crypto's value, by the time the investigators found it in 2020, those 51,000 bitcoins were worth a staggering $3.5 billion. It was one of the largest single seizures in U.S. history. Which brings us to the final and maybe the most bizarre chapter of this entire story, the unclaimed fortune. In his attempt to get back a stolen $400,000, Jimmy Zhang lost billions. His own call for help led directly to his own downfall.
So, for pulling off a wire fraud scheme involving $3.5 billion, Zhang was sentenced to just 1 year and 1 day in federal prison. But believe it or not, the story still has one final, fascinating twist. After seizing the $3.5 billion, the FBI did something pretty unusual. They put out a public notice, inviting the original owners, the people who had their Bitcoin stolen from the Silk Road way back in 2012, to come forward and reclaim their property.
And here's the kicker. Absolutely no one did. Not a single person came forward. Because, of course, to claim that money, you would have to admit that you had an account on the Silk Road in the first place, which would basically be an open confession that you were involved in criminal activity.
And that leaves us with a final thought. Here's this massive fortune that was stolen, then recovered, and yet it remains completely unclaimed. While Jimmy Zhang went to prison over a few $100,000, billions in illicit funds are now just sitting in government hands. Because for its original owners, the risk of claiming it was just way too high.